My name is Scott Harvey, and I am performing a hostile takeover of the Murder Police podcast.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, Episode 0. Who are Wendy and David? Part 1 of 2.
Well, welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. I am not David or Wendy Lyons. My name is Scott Harvey, and I am performing a hostile takeover of the Murder Police Podcast because I have been a listener since episode 1. David is a friend and a client of mine. A little background on me. I am a retired law enforcement officer and I retired as sergeant, ran our Citizens Police Academy, ran our community services division. Words are hard. But ran our community services division, and I retired in 2018 and took my speaking career, which was part-time while I worked at the police department, to a full-time basis and added coaching, added a podcast, added all the things. And David is a member of my Mastermind. And we got to talking one day and I said, David, I love the Murder Police Podcast, which I've listened to every episode, but I know you and Wendy, but your listeners don't know you and Wendy. I said, you need to let them in on who you guys are. He said, you know what? That's weird, though, to kind of talk about yourselves on your podcast. I said, so we'll make it not weird. I will come and interview you guys, do a hostile takeover, and find out kind of what the listeners want to know that they just haven't asked. So honored to be here, David and Wendy. Excited to be in the Murder Police Podcast studios. Did not partake from the bourbon collection that's outside because I wanted to be able to enunciate appropriately, even though I messed up the office I work for. So welcome, David and Wendy, to your own podcast.
Thank you for having us, Scott.
Thank you very much for doing this. I'm super grateful. I've been excited ever since you offered it, because it did dawn on me that the only thing we did was like a little 60-second trailer, I think, in the beginning, and we've never slowed down to really talk about who we are. And the relationship is getting pretty strong with our listeners, and I think they'll find some of the things that we've done and that we're into now are pretty interesting and a lot of familiarity. They'll learn that we're just like they are.
Yeah, it's kind of funny the way it played out. I said, you need somebody to interview you all. And you said, let me know when you're ready. And I was like, don't tempt me, brother, because I will be there. I love talking to people. I love asking difficult questions. And so we're going to jump in. We've talked about this, David and Wendy. This is a successful podcast. I mean, you guys have got a good thing going. You know that. Your listeners know that. This isn't a surprise. But how did we end up here? How did we get to the Murder Police Podcast?
Wow. There were some discussions a couple of years ago with a few people that I knew, Jack Patty and Ray the DA Larson, who we unfortunately lost just about a year ago, where we were all talking about maybe going into some kind of a show or concept. And there were a lot of ideas bounced around. And at the given time, for example, Jack remains a very good friend of mine, and he's still with VLK Radio. Is in his career right now, it probably wasn't a good time to jump and make a move yet. Although down the road, I think we'll hear from Jack. And Ray offered to help us get off the ground, which was good. But I remember when I was thinking of the concept and we were thinking of what the name would be. And one day I was mowing, and as you just pulled up, here at the Murder Police Farm, is that we've got a handful of acres. And I was mowing, and it kind of came over me that my wife, Wendy, is a true crime fiend. I don't want to say addict, but a true crime fiend. That is all that's on in the house. I think one of the things that I love about being retired is I don't get those text messages at 3:30 in the morning and her 42-question follow-up on a one-line sentence. But she really she's just like our fan base. And I thought, my Lord, she's here in the house, and that she would represent the audience wonderfully. I asked her into it. I don't think she really understood maybe altogether what we were going to do with it, because maybe I didn't. That's where the concept came to. And I picked the Murder Police Podcast because in the police business in a lot of places, if you're a homicide detector, you're the murder police, just like a narcotics officer is a narc and whatever. So it's been an inside for a lot of cultures to be the murder police. I thought it had a good ring to it, came up with some licensed artwork and did a little work with that. And we did a trailer and started recording episodes. And we're pinching ourselves. We've talked in the Mastermind before. This is a hobby. We're sitting down here in the basement in a room that we kind of converted for this. it's moving along quite well. I'm just astounded at the growth that we've had and continue to have. The last I checked, according to Listen Notes, we're in the top 1% of over 2.8 million podcasts worldwide. That's a pretty good place to be.
Yeah, it is.
And I think when you asked about how we got there, I think a lot of it is consistency and faith. It's just going. And everything you'll read about doing a podcast is where most struggle is if they get disappointed or forget or just don't keep going. Consistency, I think, is what sells. And then we have a fantastic audience. I can't say enough about it because their inquisitiveness is amazing. And everything I've seen, they've got giant hearts. So from my perspective, that's how we're here. That's how Wendy became so much of a fundamental piece of this, because being a listener and being a fan of this kind of genre is what the listeners get, is that she will ask those questions literally that they're thinking. So if me and some of the other police get technical or go in a different direction, she'll reel us in. Just like if you and I had a conversation about what we did, we'll pass people up sometimes just with acronyms and slang and things like that, and she reels us in.
So Wendy, as a true crime fiend, as he says, I don't know if that's how you describe yourself or not, but is this like dream come true for you? Is this a different side of the coin? How does this work with your love of true crime stuff?
Well, I think true crime fiend does describe me well. It is always on the television. And I have my select shows that I really like to watch. I'm not a CSI. That stuff's not real for those of you who are into it. But there are real true crime shows that I just love and I love to read also. So I don't know that I'm pinching myself per se. A lot of these cases that we talk about are cases that, I've heard David talk about over the years. And so I've known the basis of them and they're just really interesting. And of all the ones we have, I always say Haley McCone is my favorite. It's if you've not listened, listeners, please do. It's a tragic story of a murder of a 13-year-old little girl by a serial killer. But there's a book about the serial killer as well. And so I guess I like to take things in different avenues. I like to know about the case. Then I like to read up or study on who the murderer was. So for me, it's just doing something that I enjoy doing. It's not a labor of love. It's not tough. It's just a very much, somebody wants to talk true crime, I talk it. And what better place to talk it than with shows that I know about, or maybe some of them I don't know about. And a lot of times that's where the questions are generated. Some of the shows I haven't heard of, or David's asked people in Chattanooga on a case we did before of a 14-year-old girl that was murdered. So I love details. David always says that you're so detail-oriented, and I just want to know all the details and why and when and then what happened. And so I just take my natural who I am and apply that, and just subsequently ends up being that other people want to know those same details, mostly women.
Nice.
True.
Hey, Murder Police Podcast fans. The Murder Police Podcast now has its own merch and swag store. Go to themurderpolicepodcast.com and click the Murder Police merch store button now.
One of the things I appreciate about the Murder Police Podcast, unlike you, Wendy, I don't do the police shows. I don't watch police movies because they aggravate me as a retired police officer, because most of that crap's just not true. It pulls me out of the reality of the movie. It pulls me out of it because it's just not real. But I like the Murder Police because it doesn't glorify the perpetrators. It raises up the victims. It gives them a voice. It tells their story, which we know is the only way they still survive. The families say, I have permission to share Burke Rhodes' story when I do presentations. I've gotten permission from his wife, and she said, Scott, that's the only way he survives. Please tell his story. And the Murder Police isn't glorifying violence or anything. It's just honoring those that have been left behind. And I appreciate that about this show. David, we're talking about how we got into this podcast, but when did you get into policing? Give people some history kind of about how you started in this job.
I actually started with the Lexington Police Department in 1992, so it's been some time ago. But I can tell you that I was interested in law enforcement maybe since I was 6 years old. And people will look at that and doubt, but if you really get police to talk to you, they knew at an early age, usually there was a calling. And for us that really believe in what this job is about, it's a vocation. I knew I've always wanted to do that. I tried some things outside policing before, and I worked on an ambulance as an EMT in Louisville for a few years, which was a great experience. It got me ready for this, but the itch never left. And so finally in 92, as I applied and was fortunate enough to get hired with the Lexington Police Department, which is one of the most progressive professional PDs that I've been around. And I can say that without bias, even though I was there. So I spent my career there and had been blessed with a lot of really neat assignments to move around. As people might have heard before, by the time I retired 2 years ago, I was working the last 5 years at the appointed rank of commander. I think in one of the pre-interview things you were talking about how that's not a lot of heavy lifting, and it's not. And we could argue that by the time you get into the command level, you're practically not the police anymore.
Right.
So there's a part that you love your role as a leader, but it's not the same. And of all those experiences, I think what stood out was the time I spent in the homicide unit, because we had a real team. All of the team dynamics that you hear about, read about, and try to learn, we lived. And nothing ever compared to that. I always tell people that over on the wall, I've got a significant collection of badges in a shadow box. The one that meant the most was the one I only have one copy of that said detective. Mm. That was a passion. I had to eventually move out of that because of family issues and things that I knew that I was about to occupy too much time if I stayed in there raising my daughter, because it demands so much of you. Mm-hmm. It is not a 9 to 5. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, if anybody goes into that business and thinks it's a 9 to 5, they need to leave. Mm-hmm. It's going to take more of it. That's my career path on there, and I think that's what spoke to me this. And thanks for recognizing what we do with victims, because I've always been big on victim advocacy. The people I worked with were that. In this show, we do like the idea that we're memorializing some people. Mm-hmm. Google and the internet is relatively new in history. I can give you an example that there's some of the cases we've covered that before we covered them, if you Google the victim's name, you might find a copy of an appellate decision based on the defendant. But there's nothing about who these people are. And one of the things we respectfully do, and I think lovingly do, like you said, is we launch them into the immortality of the internet. Because once we have them indexed on there, it'll open doors for people to learn more about these. And we've had so many family members reach out and say the same thing you did with Bert's family. Mm-hmm. That means a lot. That's why we're going to start. This is airing in August of 2022. And one of the things in this remake after this vacation we took is you're going to hear a lot more unsolves and missings to really get these word out on people.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important too. You loved the murder police aspect of your job, being the homicide detective and everything, but you left that for family reasons. I don't think you would be where you are today had you stayed in as a murder police detective, because it's just so wearing on you psychologically.
I think it is.
I think it's a good job for a season. I don't think it's a good job for a career personally.
And people do it. It was kind of hard to leave in some ways, but I will say that you do go through a lot. And now in retirement, you unpack that stuff slowly. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why, like on our website, you're not going to find pictures of deceased people and mm-hmm. things. That's not how we want to remember these people. And quite frankly, some of the shows that are out there are overly gratuitous with that. Mm-hmm. That's a little disturbing. But that's their bailiwick if they want to go that way. But these people meant more than just being a blip on a uniform crime report every year.
Right.
They deserve to be more than that. And their families deserve to have a place where people can learn about who they are to the best. And it's tough. Going back and getting a personal history on somebody from 20, 30 years ago is almost impossible. Mm-hmm. But we give it the best shot we can.
Yeah. Nice. So, Wendy, that's some of David's history. When did you enter the picture of David? When did you come in to kind of thank God, smooth out some of these rough edges and make him the man that he is today?
David and I met, don't make me tell a year, 9 years ago. We met. We got married 4 years ago. Bless his heart, it took 5 years to ask me to marry him. I think he was just pinching himself that whole time at this gem that he had stumbled upon. And so finally, he asked me to marry him, and we did. We got married February 10th. Do you remember the year, David?
I do now, yeah.
Do you want to tell it? It's 2018.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Way to make her say it so that you could confirm it, David.
Oh, yes.
Well played.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it took him forever to remember our anniversary for a while, but we met, and it was kind of ironic the way we met. You know, I had attended Lexington Police Department's Police Academy in 2005, and I went through that, and there was a lady that she and I were very good friends, and after I left, after the academy, she and I remained friends, and we would hang out a lot, and I guess, David, maybe you were her sergeant at the time. I don't know how you and she knew each other. Maybe you just knew her, but he and she were friends on Facebook, and he would often comment on our pictures of, you know, she and I at dinner or things that we were out doing. And, you know, how it does, it suggests someone as your friend. And I don't know who friend requested who first, but we became friends on there. And I had unfortunately lost my dad, and David was sending messages, or actually he wasn't sending messages at that time. He was commenting, "Sorry for your loss. I've been there. I know how hard that is." And one day he messaged me, or I messaged him. I was thanking him for reaching out because it was a very tough time for me when I lost him. He said that he had a dream that we had gone to dinner at a Mexican restaurant and that I was ordering the food in Spanish. And I said, "Well, actually, I do speak Spanish." And so I said, "Well, maybe we should go to a Mexican dinner sometime." And he, you know, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that." But only he didn't ask. Like, that was in December. And finally, I don't know if I kept begging enough, or maybe he was just tired of the messages or was bored. I don't know. But we ended up going out in April to that dinner, and that's how it all began. And you know, I knew that he was with Lexington Police, obviously because of my friend, but he was a sergeant. No, I'm sorry, he was a lieutenant at that time. And then we were together when he got appointed commander. But I've been there for the last 9 years through his career, and it's something that we both enjoy. We both are law enforcement enthusiasts and supporters, and so I think that kind of made it a good match.
A very true story. The dream was one of those clear dreams, and I called it Spanglish at the time,
right?
That we were eating at the restaurant. But it, you know, every now and then you have that type of dream that is just different. You know, I had some with some of the casework, and maybe one time during a show we'll talk about what that is, and people will probably think, "Well, he's nuts." But it was one of those dreams that was about as real and technical.
Well, and maybe I should add that our first date, we actually went to a Mexican restaurant called Mi Pequeña Hacienda, and he got there first. He's very punctual, and I'm not. I have time management issues that I don't care about correcting, because it's just too late in life to even fix that. But he was there, and I walked in, and we had just ordered the drinks, and the chips came, and we'd ordered the food. The food had literally just gotten set on the table, and David said, "Oh, I have to go get my daughter. I've got to go." And I thought, oh my gosh, this is one of those ploys, because I had been single for a while and I'd been dating, and I would tell my best friend, Angela, who we also have done a podcast on, that I unfortunately lost this year due to murder. I told her, when, you know, how people do when you're dating, "Hey, if I send you a message, text me and say I need to come get my son, or text me and say I've got to come pick you up, you're out of gas." So when the food arrived and David said, "I got to go," I thought, I wonder who's texting him to get him out of this date. And I really didn't think I'd see him again, but he promised that we would go out again. And he really did call a couple of days later, and we did again.
It was a genuine speed date, because I remember, and honestly, my daughter, Brooke, the floor mat you saw as we walked in got me that for Father's Day, and that's on social media if people want to see it. I was single dad with her since she was 8. So she was in Lafayette High School band at the time. When they got back from a trip or got done with practice, you know how it is, because you have daughters, as you go. So I just remember looking at Wendy, and she's putting food in a to-go box as I'm leaving. It was kind of funny.
Because you can't leave them sitting there on the curb like the Island of Misfit Toys, where the last kid picked up, nobody cares. We walk out of volleyball practice. I coach volleyball, and if there's kids sitting out there, I'm like, it's the Island of unloved kids.
Yeah.
Do you have somebody coming for you? They're like, they're on their way. So, you don't want to be that parent.
No,
so,
and we know as parents when our children get older, because Brooke is 24 and married to a fantastic young man named Keaton. I love him to death too. But when you look back, you miss that you missed that whole hustle, that whole thing. I mean, that's the whole reason I had a minivan, which would get me laughed at work so many times. It wasn't funny.
You probably shouldn't tell that.
Yeah, I probably should. And I finally, when we got the farm and she was older, I finally got a pickup truck because,
God.
Yeah, because at the lumber yard in Lancaster, Kentucky, those guys would cry with laughter when I would pull in to get 16-foot fence boards. And I probably never should have tried that anyway, but I digress.
So, Wendy, what's the best part about being a police wife? Because I think that's something that people always wonder. They hear about police wives. They kind of think they know what it is. But what's the best part in your experience of being a police wife?
I think for myself, just watching David's love of law enforcement in general, and people that I speak to or had spoken to in the past always say what a great guy and great leader David was when they worked under him or worked with him. How fair he was. And he was so very well respected with Lexington Police Department and other places we have gone, other agencies that are familiar with him. They say the same thing. I think for myself, just David's love of helping others, obviously as a police, as you know, Scott, it's not all dewdrops on rose petals. Sometimes the jobs are very ugly and you're arresting people and it's fighting blood, sweat, and tears. But I think because I always have had an interest in law enforcement, and obviously David did as well, there was that part of us that connected. Like we could share stories, and because I didn't spend but barely, not even quite a year there was so much I didn't know but wanted to know. I wanted to go into crimes against children had I stayed when it was time to be eligible to go into a detective bureau. And so I would ask questions about what it was like in that department, or how would you handle this? And so I always had that interest there. So I think marrying David, it was kind of like filling that little void that I had, or when I watched those shows, wondering the inquisitiveness of that job and how people handle it. And he did it with grace.
And I'm sure you've gotten used to having your back to the crowd at the restaurant, because most police officers have to sit against the wall, facing the room, all of that stuff. Do you notice, Wendy, when he notices stuff, like when his radar goes off? I mean, do you see a change in him?
I do. And I have to tell a funny story, because when in the academy, they tell you when you go in, sit, observe the room, observe the exits, sit with your back. So when we first got together, it was kind of like I wanted to sit against the wall and he wanted to sit against the wall. And I thought, well, he did do it longer than me, and he's a good bit older than me. So
and he has the gun.
And he has, well, I've got one too, but he always has his. But I was like, well, maybe I should just I'll let him think that I'm submissive in that area, but that's the only one.
Right.
So he does. And I will tell you, I'm always amazed. There's two stories I'm going to tell about David, and I'm going to toot your horn, David. So one of them, I was watching a show. He had been outside and he came in, and I'm watching this interview. I don't know if it was First 48 or what it was, but something I was watching, and they were interviewing a lady, and she was part of a suspect in a murder. And he comes in, he's getting himself something to drink, and he's kind of glancing at the television and going back and fixing the drink. And a couple seconds later, he looks over and he says, "Is she a prostitute?" And I looked at him and I said, "Oh my God, how did you know? Have you seen this episode?" And he's like, "No, I just knew." And I said, "How did you know? You've had to have seen this." And he said, "No, I've not seen it." And he said, "I just know the way she's answering, her mannerisms, and she wasn't doing anything, and she wasn't dressed in any sort of way that I would have thought she was a prostitute." But he said, "It's just her mannerisms and the answers that she's giving." And I thought, wow, he really does know this stuff. So I was really amazed by that. And then I will tell you, we often love to go, any of our locals here, or any of our not locals that want to look it up. Shaker Village in Harrodsburg, Kentucky is a favorite place for us. We will often go there maybe once every couple of months, stay all night. In the summer, they have bands out there, delightful food. It's just a beautiful little spot, very quaint. And we went about 2 months ago, and we were sitting outside listening to a band, sipping some wine. And David says, "The girl over there to our 11 o'clock, she's really on something." And I said, "Why?" So I look at 11 o'clock and trying to be not obvious. And sure enough, she's rubbing her nose. She keeps doing this thing with her hands, keeps flipping her arms around. Then she'd sit still. Then she'd rub her face and do her arms and sit still. And he said, now that guy, he's probably on this. He's not moving as much. He said, but she's really feeling it. And as we sat and watched, sure enough, he was right. And she just kept doing it and kept doing it. And it was so obvious after he pointed it out. So he's very observant. I will say that. And I'm often amazed at the things that he notices, or he'll say, we've got to get out of here. This is kind of going to get a little bit ugly over here. We've got to go. And so, yeah, I don't know if it's the love of the job, the experience in the job, or maybe just David's age. Is that bad?
No,
I think they say with age comes wisdom. Honey, maybe that's why you're so smart.
We hope. But Scott, that's what the career does to you. And it's not a bad thing, but you do become pretty much an expert on human behavior to that degree. And I don't think people appreciate that until they're around it.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't go away. And it's not like ultra paranoia and it's not hypervigilance, but it's the idea that you and I can go somewhere and probably watch something for a few seconds and take our wives and say, hey, let's pay the check and go. Mm-hmm. And we know that whatever's going on there, we just know we just don't want to be around ground zero.
Right. Early in our marriage, my wife would ask immediately, like, what's going on? Because she would see the change in my countenance. I saw something when we were sitting at the restaurant or we were out and about, and she would see, then she would ask immediately. We're 25 years in now. She might, on the way home, she's like, did you see something weird in the restaurant? Because I picked up on something, and she's always right. But we were in New York several years ago in a subway station, and I'm sitting on a bench while my wife and her parents, because they went with us, are looking at the subway map. And I'm just sitting on a bench watching people. And this guy goes over to help them find where they're trying to get to on the subway. And he gets really close to her and her purse. So I'm just watching this guy. And he didn't do anything. He helped them find where they were going to. And then he left. And my wife told me on the subway, she goes, I saw you watching that guy. He was super nice. I said, that guy, before he came to talk to you, jimmied a piece of metal up the payphone to clear change out of the coin receptacle in the bottom. I said, so he's going to steal change from a payphone. He's going to steal from your purse if he can. So that's why I was watching that guy. Like he was super nice. No, of course he was. Because you look like an easy mark, the obvious out-of-towners in the New York City subway station. So we notice those things, Wendy, and we appreciate you all humoring us and asking when it's appropriate, all that stuff. What did they not prepare you for being a police wife, Wendy? Anything that's you kind of caught you by surprise, maybe?
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police Podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police Podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.
It'll leak. Like you can't seal that box up. It'll leak. It'll start poisoning the rest of your life. And I think for you, what I appreciated about those episodes with Angie is it was you processing what you went through and allowing us to kind of see what that looks like.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast. Episode 0, Who Are Wendy and David? Part 2 of 2.
We notice those things, Wendy, and we appreciate you all humoring us and asking when it's appropriate, all that stuff. What did they not prepare you for being a police wife, Wendy? Anything that's you kind of caught you by surprise, maybe?
No, not really that caught me by surprise. I guess because I knew enough of it, having gone through the academy, so I wasn't totally surprised. aside of when he went back into as a commander, I don't know if you're a commander or a lieutenant, when you went back up to the homicide and special victims unit, he ran that for a while.
A commander.
He was a commander. And we weren't yet married at that point when he was up there. But you know what? When I was over at his house for the weekend or something like that, the phone would go off constantly. And it might go off and an hour later go off again. And me, loving crime like I do, I wanted to ask a million questions. It wasn't, oh no, the phone's ringing. I wanted to know, well, what did it say? Well, where's it at? Well, are they dead? Well, what hospital did they go to? Well, what started it? Did they find the suspect? Is the victim going to be all right? And he would say, please, that's all the details I have. Go back to sleep. And then in the morning, I'd say, did any more texts come? Because I didn't hear it go off. and so when it was his time to be duty commander of the city, the phone went off a lot. And so that was great for me because I wanted to know what happened. But for him, it wasn't. But I guess I had dealt with that through the dating process, and I knew a little bit of it through being in the academy of what things can happen and transpire. But I think for most wives that are new to it, that don't have a law enforcement background, just be patient because sometimes he might not be home. He's got to work over, especially if you're in homicide. Like David said earlier, that's not a 9 to 5. And as our listeners may have heard, some of these detectives, they're there for 24, 25, 27 straight hours, and they might get to go home and take a 2-hour cat nap and then go right back at it again. So I think the job itself is incredibly demanding. And as a police wife, just be understanding and maybe don't ask as many questions as I do because I don't think they like that.
I would finally just tell her to get up in the morning, catfish the suspects on Facebook, and call the detectives with what you find out.
And I did catfish.
Oh, she was all over it. She knew more than they knew in the DB. Yes. I know that for a fact. Because she'd call and tell me her results.
Right. But at the same time, I think it's important, you bring an interesting point, Wendy, and I tell law enforcement officers all the time, I was like, you need someone to unload to. You need somebody safe that you can dump this stuff to. And I'm sure he came home and told you about difficult situations, difficult cases, sometimes that were just kind of stuck in his head.
No, he really didn't, Scott. He doesn't talk about that.
That's sad.
It is sad because I want to know, not because I'm trying to be compassionate or empathetic towards him. I just want to know. But David really doesn't. He doesn't talk about it.
Okay.
I'm the talker in the marriage, and I love sharing details and I love getting details. But David's kind of closed off with that stuff.
It's because I'm an introvert.
He's not an introvert. He just doesn't, whether it's maybe he doesn't want to relive it. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he just wants to kind of suppress that. I don't know. But I just don't ask questions. I mean, I'll ask the basic questions that I could get out of him.
Right.
But, when I lost Angie, I had asked him, one of the first things I had to go and let ServPro in. And that was really horrific, that scene in her house. And then I had gone and seen her at the corner to pay my respects with her. And I asked him, that scene in the home, how do you unsee that? And he said, you just don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as much detail as I got from him on that. And he later said, for him, he just can't talk about that stuff because it's difficult. And so I just didn't ask him anymore about it because I'm figuring, I saw it from my best friend. Not that it would be easier seeing it from someone that you don't know multiple times, but I think it was different when, in that podcast, as I explained, I went through that whole horrid relationship that she had been through. So I think it hit closer to home for me because of who she was and what she had endured. But David doesn't open up about that stuff.
Well, I mean, to be fair, there is a part of our brain that turns off in scenes like that, like the emotional side of our brain. It's a survival function. It's just how you get through it. You turn that emotion off. Now, if it's a family member or a friend, you're just not going to turn that off. And I think you, Wendy, handled that beautifully when you did the tribute podcast. Is the only way I can describe it. Is it was a tribute to Angela and to victims everywhere, empowering victims. It doesn't have to work out this way. We can stop this before we get here. And I think what you did, Wendy, whether you know it or not, is you processed that.
Yeah.
You processed that for all of us to hear. You got it out because there's some misconception in law enforcement there where we can just put the lid on this case, slide it back on the shelf, and it never bother us again. And if you don't process it with somebody, David probably went back to the detective bureau and talked about it with the officers and kind of processed that way. It'll leak. Like, you can't seal that box up. It'll leak. It'll start poisoning the rest of your life. And I think for you, what I appreciated about those episodes with Angie is it was you processing what you went through and allowing us to kind of see what that looks like.
Yeah, I think because most people, fortunately, don't have to or haven't had that misfortune of having seen that. And I think for me, because David always says I'm such a linear thinker, as bad as that was, I needed that because I couldn't accept that had happened to her. But, my intuition was on such high point. As soon as someone posted on our little What's Happening in Nicholasville page on Facebook, I knew. And I went into the office. He was working on something on the computer. And I said, I know. I just know this is her. And no name was released. It's all it said is they heard shots fired. And I knew as soon as I saw that it was her. And of course I was correct. But it does help to talk about it. And I would say, your original question about the police wife, what that entails, maybe don't ask as many questions as you'd love to know, because maybe some people don't want to share that. Reliving that sometimes is very hard. Even if it's not anybody that they knew, it really takes a toll on your body having seen that and seeing it day in and day out. I don't really think I could do that.
Yeah. And make no mistake, police wives serve as well. Like it is,
Yes,
it's a
absolutely.
calling, it is a service, because you all support, I say police wives, affectionately as police husbands as well, police spouses, police significant others. Like, they support the law enforcement officer to do their job. To be a safe space to come home to means a lot. To provide a safe space for us to kind of unplug our brains from a hard day at work. And you guys don't get the answers you deserve a lot of times, and you still love us anyways. So it's a calling, and we appreciate you all for that.
Well, thank
for sure.
you. And if you're a crime enthusiast, it's icing on the cake, because then you might get some goods on what just happened.
There you
Awesome.
go.
I love that part.
Yeah, that's true.
Hey, Murder Police Podcast fans. The Murder Police Podcast now has its own merch and swag store. Go to themurderpolicepodcast.com and click the Murder Police merch store button now.
So, David, good career. I mean, you're a commander. We touched on this earlier, which you said is not really policing anymore. It's probably more aggravating because you're dealing with police who aren't policing the way they should, which is a lot of a commander's job. You're kind of holding the standard and holding people accountable. But why retire? Why not stay in the commander position? Was there something that you wanted to retire for, or it was just time, or what?
Well, a couple years out, I had come up with a feeling. They always say that this job will let you know when it's about time. It's a very true thing. You could start to feel 2 years out that felt like I was heading for the sunset anyway, right? Mm-hmm. You could feel there's a dramatic shift, and you're not angry, you're not spiteful, you're not bitter, but you're really thinking you're done and ready to do different things. And so I knew I was kind of honing in that direction. And what ended up happening several months before I went ahead and retired, it was kind of a surprise for me and everybody else, is that I had a health issue that came up. And at one point I was actually diagnosed with bronchial carcinoma, which is a form of lung cancer, even though I've never smoked. Very difficult time, very scary time. Wendy was super supportive of it, because at one point when we were looking at treatment options, my thoracic surgeon, he said, I'm going to take at least 3/4, if not your entire left lung. What that meant was a long recovery. And I remember coming to Wendy with it, and he was going to do that regardless of cancer or not, because of where the spot was in my lung. And I told her, I said, there's a couple ways I can look at this. I can either stay, have this surgery done, and have like a 6-month recovery and go back to a job with short-terming on regardless, that I know I'm on my way out, and burn all my vacation time or sick time. Or I can retire. We are blessed at my agency with the Irving County government to where they actually buy your unused sick time back, which is a really good little check as you retire. And we talked about it a lot. There's a few things I would have liked to have knocked out maybe, but it spoke to me, and I was like, this is it, because then I can do a recovery on my own terms without feeling rushed, without going back to work and whatnot. So I went ahead and pulled the pin. Didn't regret it. I was ready to go. I think that was the big thing, is I was ready to go.
I was hoping he'd stay so I could get more stories.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. Because you know what? This is funny. We'll be somewhere, and it just happened in Vegas. And a guy goes, they're giving discounts at some show, and law enforcement and first responders. I said, what about retired? And I usually don't do that. She'll tell you that's, I don't know why it fell out. And what you said something like, well, he did 28 years, not 30, but he did 28. It's like
he could have stayed longer, but he chose not to.
To her, it's almost like I ran the marathon and didn't quite get across the 26-mile mark.
So. I often bring up a name of an officer. I won't say it on here, but he was there, 100 years almost. Yeah. And I would say his name. Well, he's still there, and he's been on 37 years. Mm-hmm. And he'll say, I am not doing that. And I think, David, also, you didn't tell. David teaches as well for FBI LEDA, and David loves to teach. And one thing that people always tell me about David is how exceptional he was as a teacher in the classroom for different things, law enforcement related. So prior to David leaving Lexington Police Department, he would use a week of vacation here or there to go teach for FBI LEDA. And he now pretty much does it more than he worked for Lexington Police. He loves that, though. That's his niche. I think he thrives being in that environment, teaching chiefs, lieutenants, commanders, whatever he's teaching. And he enjoys it. So we laughed at first because when he retired initially, he didn't have a teaching gig lined up for a few weeks. And he had been home for probably a couple of straight weeks. And I remember saying to him one day, you have got to get a job. You cannot sit here day in and day out. This ain't going to work. And so he did go, and he teaches quite often now, but he loves that, and I'm supportive of it. And some days he's gone 3 days, and some days he's gone 5 days. And as David said, we were in Vegas, and we met up with another friend of ours, and he's also an instructor, former chief for 2 different departments. And I think he said something about the wives are so supportive. David, they were toasting a little bourbon at this little place we were sitting at, and they were talking about how supportive the wives are, that they go and teach 5 days a week. And I remember she's more subdued and quiet, and I'm not. And I piped up and I said, you all are doing us a favor. You do not have to thank us. We're so glad you're gone 5 days. But of course, I miss him when he's gone, but I know he loves that. And so David isn't truly retired. So that's what he enjoys doing. And then the murder police is just something fun that we do when we can come down in the basement and squeeze in an episode.
So he's blowing around the country teaching leadership, which is an important thing. I don't want to downplay that. Teaching leadership to law enforcement, where we know leadership failures cause serious issues for agencies.
Huge.
Yeah. I mean, it's always a question of leadership. You either condone it, or you should have known it and should have stopped it one way or the other. So, he's still doing that, keeping busy. Wendy, what are you doing when you're not podcasting?
Oh my, I own child care centers, 4 of them, and I love children. And that's why I wanted to stay and go into crimes against children. Totally different aspect, thank God, than what I see every day. But I own 4 child care centers, and that's my true love. That's my element. As an owner, when they need somebody in a classroom, I'm there. I'm the first to raise my hand and say, I'll work a preschool classroom any day of the week. I love children so much, in fact, that in addition to owning my centers, I sub at my son's school. And I used to love subbing the younger ones and occasionally the younger elementary, but I've developed quite the fond love of teaching the high school students, just because I'm seeing who they're developing into. And on one hand, at my childcare centers, we take children 6 weeks to 5 years. And then I'm seeing these older students as juniors and seniors and who they've evolved into at his school. So that's what I do. I just presented for the Bar Association. I think there's some pictures on our website of that. They said it best. They said, so when you're not podcasting or watching true crime, you can be found in a classroom with children. And I said, absolutely. There's always one hanging on me, hanging off me, fixing my hair. I came home last week. I sent David a picture. He was gone and they had taken markers. We talked about how people get their hair colored. And the next thing I knew, a kid said, "Can I color your hair?" And I thought we were playing until I looked and he had a magic marker and the front of my hair was very purple. And so I sent that to David. But, it's a true love of what I do. And that's a side of true crime is my heart and passion is working with children.
Yeah.
That's a real job, Scott. I mean, I always joke with people that there's real jobs out there. And policing is so fun, 28 years of fun. I couldn't do what she does. I'm risk averse. I couldn't be in that industry. And when I'm on the phone with her and she's there, I don't stay on the phone long because it really, when they're screaming in the background, it sounds like cellophane getting crumpled into the mouthpiece of the phone. And it drives me nuts. I'm like, I don't know how she does it. So hats off to her because you and I just didn't.
I always leave places like that. And my standard response is some people actually work for a living.
That's
what I would say.
Exactly.
Because what I did never really felt like work and what I do today doesn't feel like work.
No.
But as if that's not busy enough, I mean, training leaders across the country, raising the next generation of kids, 4 child care centers at a time. You guys also farm. Like you're on the Murder Police farm here. I mean, there's animals here. Talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Oh, that's just fun. My dream, I guess you could say, was always, and maybe it's because I'm not much of a neighborly type. God, that sounds horrible. But, when you hear kids all day long and it's loud, the last thing you want to do is come home and hear more noise. Because David's right. It is very loud. It's like that for 12 hours a day. Somebody's always crying. Somebody's mad. Somebody's biting. Somebody's peed their pants. It's all day. So when I come home, the last thing I want is noise. I just want to unwind with some hot tea, setting maybe even a glass of wine on occasion, watching my show. My dream was always to find a small farm, nothing huge, but I wanted something manageable and I wanted miniature horses. And I'd always told him that. And I remember in our dating, I had been looking for many places and I would call him. And, when I thought I could maybe rope him into marriage before 5 years, I'd say, "Hey, I found this place." And, I was thinking I could lure him in with like a nice farm because I knew he didn't like neighbors either. I would find it and it would have a pool. And I didn't want a pool because I've got a son and I didn't want to have that worry of something happening. Or it wouldn't have the fencing. And then I'm thinking, well, then I can't get horses unless I fence. Or I desperately wanted a basement. It wouldn't have a basement. So there was always something. And I called him one day and I said, "I found the perfect spot. You've got to come look at it." And it was where we are. It's in Nicholasville, Kentucky. And this is just outside of Lexington, Kentucky. And it's just a delightful town. The people here, they're just really good people. Our farm is 6 acres, right at 6 acres. We do have 4 miniature horses. And we have 6 chickens and a small garden. And that's it.
The mini horses are fun. And most of those are through rescues, which makes it even more. And you've met them. They have incredible personalities. And I think the thing I found out is it was interesting is she had always talked about getting them, but I always joked that I didn't know she'd get them like the first 2 weeks after she closed on the house. It was like, so I got a really nice laser miter saw and a cordless pass load nail gun because living on the farm with wood fences, you got to have those things. But they're a joy. They're like big dogs. And that's one thing we were talking about. We've got to start sharing more pictures of things like that on social media because they're fascinating animals. They're fascinating.
I just, had visions of her though all day dealing with kids that are crying and wetting their pants and coming home and seeing David crying and wetting his pants. I mean,
exactly.
Give this woman a break.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a lot,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
but I'm sincere and I'm in it for the long game.
Yeah, that's right. She signed a contract with you, right? And she's a woman of her word, thankfully. So give us a sneak peek of like what's on the horizon for Murder Police. What's upcoming? What can we expect? Whet our appetites a little bit for this upcoming season.
Yeah, it's always, and one of the things I love about our mastermind group is and I can tell people if you've never engaged in one of those, you need to give it some consideration. And I would recommend joining the one we're in or another one that you might form. It's amazing. But We know that we want to do more personalized things. We want to go into more unsolves. We want to pick up the episode pace a little bit, which takes a lot of work. You know that from having a podcast yourself. But we just formed, I'm so grateful, we just this week finally formed a focus group. I've got about 34 really diehard fans, literally from around the world, that have offered to help us with decision-making on where we're going. We took, I don't like to time date the episodes too much, but we just took July of 2022 off to kind of put this together. But when we launch with this episode in August, is we plan to have for the first time, making our merchandise available, because it's always been exclusive at this point. And anybody that's ever given us a review and recommended us knows that we're pretty quick about sending something to them, but we're going to make that available to people. We do want to get more of the unsolved in there. We're going to try to involve the fan base a little bit more. I'd like to move into giving them opportunities to actually remotely get involved in an interview when we bring a detective in or do one. A lot of content coming. One of the things we're getting ready to do is talk to, when I'm on the road with FBI Lita, I clearly meet a lot of people. And one of the contacts I made from Santa Clara, California a few months back is a Familia DNA detective. And they just identified a woman not too long ago that had been the victim of murder 30 years ago. And they put together who she is through Familia DNA. And that's coming. We're getting ready to release that. But so we'll have merchandising. And we may go ahead at some point and move into an extra bonus type situation where, for a membership fee, which will be nominal, where it is that we've got a lot of cool things that I've got in the pipeline that I want to do.
Yeah.
So.
Nice. Well, we're excited. We're excited for the new season. We're excited to pull the curtain back here on the Murder Police Farm and talk to you guys and get to know you a little bit more. So thank you for this opportunity and for you all's willingness to kind of just answer some questions, let us into your life. We're excited.
Well, I was definitely excited to have you. I remember that's why when you said that, I don't know if you had intended to do it or not, but like, when you're ready to go, like you said, and I was like, you're it, tag, you're it. You had the idea you're going to do it.
Before we get off here, Scott, why don't you tell our listeners what you do and a little bit about your podcast if they are looking for focus groups, or maybe some people don't know what Mastermind even is?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. We've got a mastermind that we meet once a week on Zoom for an hour, and we basically set goals. We hold each other accountable. I bring leadership content sometimes, bring questions sometimes that we walk through difficult parts of your business. To the problem with being an entrepreneur that I've found very quickly is that it's a lonely job. You know, when you work for yourself, there's no board of directors, there's nobody to bounce ideas off of, there's nobody to hold you accountable. And what this does is gives you a group of people who are on your side, who will help you get to the next level, whatever that looks like for you. And so I'd love to talk to people about that if they want to. The podcast is the Speaking of Harvey podcast. Now, it's been on a hiatus for the last year, because for the last year I've been writing a book.
Yes.
And the book is now turned into the publisher. So that podcast will be launching back again soon. A little bit updated, a little more communication focused, because that is really what the book is about. And that is what I do. I just help people communicate more effectively, because I get frustrated when people are not communicating their way through crisis.
Can you tell us what that book is called, or are you not at liberty to discuss that yet?
The book is called Silence Kills: Communication Tactics to Speak with Confidence and Build Your Influence. And it is going to be on the business bookshelf, but that doesn't mean it's only for business people. It's for people who are just tired of not speaking up. People who, in my experience, especially in 2022, we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we end up saying nothing. We live in a cancel culture world where if you mess up and say the wrong thing, you're just canceled. And so people say nothing. What I learned as a hostage negotiator, as a public information officer, as a human, silence without rapport feels like you don't care. So you can be silent, but your family, your coworkers, your whatever are going to assume it's because you don't care. And so this book just gives people practical ways to speak up, to get their message out, even if it's in a crisis. I would say especially in a crisis, because if you and I, David, know in the police world, if you're not the first one to tell the story, they'll never believe the real story.
Amen.
So you've got to get out there and say, even when it's difficult, start telling the story.
When should that book be available, Scott?
The plan right now, I should have copies in October that'll be available at silencekillsbook.com. And then they should be on store shelves in April. I'm learning in this process there is such a thing as a book release season. Did not know this. But if you release a book out of season, the bookstores want to say must be something wrong with it, or you're trying to sneak something in. So we wait until April to be a part of this season.
And your Mastermind focus group, is that on Facebook, or a website that our listeners could reference?
Yeah, if they go to speakingofharvey.com, they can click on the Contact Scott button. They can find out a little bit about the coaching, about the corporate speaking that I do, about the educational school assemblies. There's tabs for all of this stuff. So just go to speakingofharvey.com, click the tab, or you can email me at scott@speakingofharvey.com.
Awesome. And David, I'm sure you're going to attach that link to our...
Absolutely. Yeah, on our webpage, you have been is listed as one of our favorite personal picks. There's a link that will always be there. And I can say, too, that when we were talking again about how we came up with a podcast, unequivocally, your show, I would be out in the back in those back acres replacing fence boards 2 years ago listening. And I'm just going to tell you that listening to you do that told me, well, we can do that, too. So I was grateful. But I think I texted you one time and said I just binged you.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's, it's a podcast is something anybody can do. And I would throw writing a book in that too. And David, I know your books are coming.
Right.
They're in the process. And if you are an idea generator, which we are, and Wendy, I know there's a book in you too, if you ever decide to write one, and it's going to be entertaining for sure.
Oh,
Probably certainly would be.
Yeah, it would be. It may have an explicit lyrics label on the front of it.
It definitely would.
Yeah,
speaking of that, not to interrupt you, but I have to tell you, and I reference Angie because she was such a huge part of my life. But, we met back as 19 and 20-year-olds. We started working together, and that friendship lasted that whole time. And I remember when we worked at Lon John's Corporate in the payroll department, our little cubicles, we were in the cubicle together. Back then, all the way up until she was murdered, she said, we have got to write a book, and I already have the title. And I said, what is it? Because we would call each other and talk about who pissed us off that day, or some idiotic thing that a staff member did, or a coworker did, or just somebody in Walmart or Kroger. And she said, the book's going to be called Constantly Amazed, because the things that people do blow me away. And so it's funny that you say that, because Angie always said we had to write a book about just people and how you're constantly amazed at what they do or what they don't do, or why they thought they could do that. Maybe one day I'll write one in memory of Angie.
Well, I will get the first autograph copy. That's for sure.
Well, I will sure give it to you.
Good deal. Well, thank you again. I can't thank you enough. This was an oversight on our part, just getting busy with this hobby thing of not stopping. And like I said, usually these are done like the first episode. And so what we're going to call it episode 0 because of that. And hopefully the people that listen know a little bit more about me and Wendy on a personal level, and we'll make different connections based on that. But very grateful to you for the time.
Yes, thank you very much, Scott, for coming.
And super grateful to all those people who listen and download us on a regular basis. It truly is one of those things that obviously you can't have any followership without followers, and we have those. So thank everyone.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you all for having me.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy. Lock it down, Judy. Lock it down, Judy. Lock it down.